He was scheduled to be put down at 0600, and not a single officer argued otherwise. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere quiet, I hope, because this story doesn't shout, it breathes. The kennel sat at the far end of the precinct yard, where the chain-link fences hummed softly in the cold, and the overhead lights flickered like they were tired of witnessing the same endings. It was just past midnight, the kind of hour when even the city seems to lower its voice, when patrol cars roll slower and coffee goes cold in forgotten cups. Inside the last enclosure, behind a reinforced steel gate, Rex stood perfectly still. No barking, no pacing, just watching. His silhouette cut sharp against the dim yellow light, ears forward, body tense but controlled, like a soldier waiting for a command that would never come. They called him aggressive, unpredictable, a liability, words written in bold across his file like a verdict no one cared to question. 3 handlers in 6 months. All of them gave up, said he didn't listen, said he couldn't be trusted. But none of those reports mentioned the way he watched the door, not with anger, but with something quieter, something closer to expectation. The air carried the faint scent of disinfectant and old rain, seeping through the concrete floor, mixing with the metallic trace of the bars that held him in place. Somewhere down the row, another dog whimpered in its sleep, but Rex didn't move. He hadn't laid down in hours, maybe longer. It was hard to tell with animals like him, the kind that learned early not to relax. A clipboard hung outside his enclosure, edges curled from use, a red stamp pressed across the top, final evaluation. Beneath it, a single line had been added in black ink, written quickly, almost carelessly, unfit for service. Recommend euthanasia. No signature, no hesitation, just a decision. The kind that ends stories before anyone thinks to ask how they began. A gust of wind slipped through the corridor, rattling the loose latch on the neighboring gate. Rex's ears twitched. His head turned slightly, not toward the noise, but toward the far end of the hallway, where the door remained. Closed. Waiting. Always waiting. Because somewhere in the fragments of memory he couldn't explain, there was a pattern. Footsteps meant orders. Orders meant purpose. Purpose meant he belonged. But tonight, there were no footsteps. Only silence stretching thin across concrete and steel. He stepped forward once, slow, deliberate. His nails clicked softly against the floor, echoing just enough to remind the empty room that he was still there. Still breathing. Still holding on. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale, the deep navy of night giving way to that first fragile hint of dawn. In a few hours, someone would walk down this hallway with a key and a routine they'd performed too many times to feel anything at all. They would open the gate, call his name, expect nothing in return. But right now, in this narrow space between darkness and morning, Rex stood at the edge of something unseen. Not rage, not fear, something else, something waiting to be recognized. And if you had been there, standing just outside that gate, you might have noticed it too, not in his teeth, not in his stance, but in his eyes. He wasn't asking to be spared. He was waiting to be understood. The man did not speak when he entered, and that was the first thing that set him apart from the others. Most filled silence with commands, with sharp tones and rehearsed authority, as if volume alone could bend something broken back into shape. But this one carried his quiet like it meant something. He stepped into the corridor slowly, boots landing soft against the concrete, not dragging, not rushing, each step placed with intention instead of urgency. The morning light followed him in, pale and cool, brushing against the steel bars and catching briefly in his shadow before settling into the corners of the room. He paused just inside the threshold, taking in the space without scanning it like a checklist. He looked, really looked, at the rows of enclosures, at the empty water bowls, at the worn edges of the floor where countless paws had paced the same restless paths. And then his eyes found the last gate. Rex did not move, not because he was frozen, but because something in him had decided to wait. The man approached without reaching for anything on his belt. No baton, no leash, no gloves, just his hands, empty and visible, hanging loosely at his sides. His uniform was clean but not new, sleeves rolled just enough to show forearms marked by time rather than decoration. His name patch caught the light as he stepped closer. Hayes. Daniel Hayes. He stopped a few feet from the gate, not close enough to provoke, not far enough to dismiss. Just present. The clipboard beside the enclosure shifted slightly in the breeze, tapping softly against the metal. Daniel glanced at it, just once, eyes moving across the stamped words without lingering. He did not pick it up. He did not read the notes. Whatever story it told, he chose not to hear it that way. Instead, he lowered his gaze to the dog behind the bars. Rex held that gaze. No growl, no retreat, just watching, the same way he had watched everything else. But this was different. There was no tension pushing between them, no invisible line daring one to cross the other. Only a quiet space, waiting to be filled by something neither of them rushed to define. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and then, without warning or announcement, he did something no one else had tried. He stepped closer and lowered himself down, not onto a knee in readiness, but all the way to the ground, sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete, as if the space belonged to both of them equally. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and final. He did not lean forward. He did not extend his hand. He simply sat there, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, breathing even. The kind of posture that did not ask for control. It offered something else. Time passed in that position. A minute, maybe more. Long enough for the building to settle around them again, for the distant sounds of morning to creep back into the edges of the moment. Rex's ears shifted forward, then back, then forward again, processing not a command, but an absence of one. He took a single step closer to the gate, his paws silent now against the floor. His nose lifted, drawing in the man's scent fully for the first time. It was not sharp, not tense. There was no trace of the quickened breath he had come to associate with hesitation, no spike of adrenaline that usually followed human proximity. Just something steady, grounded, familiar in a way he could not place. Daniel's voice came then, low and calm, almost like it had been waiting for the exact right moment to exist. "Easy," he said, not as an order, but as a recognition. "I see you." Rex did not react the way the reports would have predicted. He did not lunge. He did not turn away. He stood there, closer now, his amber eyes fixed on the man sitting on the other side of the gate. And for the first time since the night had begun, the distance between them did not feel like a barrier. It felt like a question, one that neither of them was in a hurry to answer, but both of them had already begun to understand. The silence between them did not break. It deepened, settling into something that felt less like tension and more like a fragile understanding forming in real time, the kind that could disappear if either one moved too fast, spoke too loudly, or tried to control what had not yet chosen to be given. Daniel remained seated on the cold concrete, his posture unchanged, shoulders loose, hands resting open against his knees, not reaching, not retreating, simply allowing the moment to exist without interference. Across the gate, Rex took another step forward, slower this time, his body still aligned with caution but no longer held by it. His breathing had shifted, no longer shallow and guarded, but deeper, more measured, as if something inside him had begun to match the rhythm of the man in front of him. The metal bars between them caught the early morning light, thin lines dividing space, but no longer defining it. Daniel's eyes never left the dog, not in challenge, not in command, but in recognition, the kind that did not demand trust, only offered it. A faint sound echoed from the far end of the corridor, a door closing, a radio murmuring static, the world beginning to wake beyond these walls, but none of it reached into the space they were holding. Rex lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in thought, his ears angling forward as if listening for something deeper than sound. He moved closer until only a few inches separated him from the gate, his nose near the metal, his eyes still locked onto Daniel. This was the distance where others had failed, where tension usually snapped tight and something went wrong, where hands would pull back too quickly or voices would rise too sharply. But Daniel didn't either. He stayed. He breathed. He waited. "You are not the problem," he said quietly, the words barely louder than the hum of the lights above them, spoken not as reassurance, but as truth. Rex's ears flicked at the sound, his gaze sharpening, not in alert, but in focus. The words did not carry meaning in the way humans understood it, but the tone did, the absence of fear, the absence of force, the absence of expectation. Daniel shifted slightly then, not forward, not closer, but lower, his shoulders relaxing even further, his presence becoming smaller, less imposing, as if he were choosing to meet Rex not as an authority, but as an equal. The movement was subtle, but it mattered. It always did. Rex's nose touched the cold metal for a brief moment, then lifted again, drawing in the man's scent once more, confirming what his instincts had already begun to suggest. No threat, no pressure, no hidden edge waiting to snap, just steadiness. Daniel slowly turned one hand, palm up, resting it lightly against the ground, still several inches away from the gate, not offering it through, not asking for contact, just placing it there as a quiet invitation that could be ignored without consequence. Time stretched again, longer now, heavier, filled with possibility. Rex shifted his weight forward, one paw stepping closer, then stopping, his body held between habit and something new he did not yet trust enough to fully follow. His tail remained still, not tucked, not raised, simply neutral, waiting for a reason to move. Daniel's voice came again, softer this time, almost a whisper carried more by breath than sound. No one is going to rush you. The words settled into the space like a promise no one had ever made to the dog before. Rex blinked slowly, once, then again, a small, almost imperceptible change, but enough. His head lowered just a fraction more, his nose nearing the gap between the bars, hovering there for a moment that seemed to hold the weight of everything that had come before it. And then, without force, without command, without expectation, he leaned in just enough to close the distance on his own terms, his breath brushing lightly against the stillness of the man who had chosen not to break him, but to wait for him instead. For a moment, nothing moved, and that nothing carried more weight than any command ever shouted across this room. Rex's breath hovered in the narrow space between the bars, warm against the cool air, steady but cautious, as if he were measuring something unseen, something deeper than distance. Daniel did not shift, not a single inch. His hand remained open against the concrete, palm up, fingers relaxed, offering presence without pressure. The kind of stillness that could only come from someone who understood that trust was not taken, it was given, and only when it chose to be. Rex's nose lowered closer, just enough for the faintest current of air to pass between them, carrying scent, memory, and something neither of them could name. His ears flicked once, then settled forward, his body no longer held in rigid readiness, but not yet free either. This was the edge, the place where everything usually broke, where fear stepped in and turned hesitation into reaction, where humans pulled back too fast or reached in too soon. But Daniel didn't either. He stayed inside the moment as if it were the only place that mattered. "It is okay," he said quietly, his voice barely more than breath, the words shaped not to command, but to reassure something that had not heard reassurance in a long time. Rex blinked again, slower now, his gaze softening in a way that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. He shifted forward, one deliberate inch at a time, until the space between his nose and Daniel's hand became almost nothing. Then he stopped, not because he was afraid, but because he was deciding. That was the difference. Daniel saw it. He did not rush it. Seconds stretched, long and fragile, balanced on a choice that no one else in that building had ever waited. Long enough to see. Then, without sound, without signal, Rex closed that final distance on his own terms. His nose brushed lightly against Daniel's fingertips, just a fleeting contact, gone as quickly as it came. But it was enough. More than enough. Daniel did not react with excitement, did not reach to hold or claim what had just been offered. He let his hand remain exactly where it was, honoring the moment instead of interrupting it. Rex pulled back half an inch, watching, waiting for the usual shift, the sudden movement, the expectation that would follow contact. But it did not come. The man stayed still, steady, unchanged. And in that absence of reaction, something inside Rex began to loosen, not all at once, but enough to let the next breath come easier than the last. Outside the corridor, a voice called out distantly, footsteps approaching again, routine pressing forward as it always did, unaware that something rare had just happened in the quiet. Rex's ears turned toward the sound, his body tensing slightly out of habit, but his eyes returned to Daniel almost immediately, as if drawn back by something stronger than instinct. Daniel spoke once more, softer now, almost a whisper meant only for the space between them. "You get to choose this," he said. "Not them." Rex stood there, absorbing the tone, the steadiness, the absence of demand. Then, slowly, carefully, he stepped forward again, this time not stopping at the edge. His nose touched Daniel's hand once more, lingering a fraction longer, his breath steady now, no longer searching for danger, but recognizing something else entirely. And for the first time since anyone had placed a label on him, since anyone had written him off as something to be controlled or removed, Rex was not reacting to fear. He was responding to trust, given freely, and returned in the only way he knew how, quietly, without force, but with a meaning that did not need to be explained. The contact did not end when Rex pulled back. It changed, settling into something quieter, something steadier, like a line had been crossed without anyone forcing it open. Daniel remained where he was, his hand still resting against the concrete. But now there was a subtle shift in the space between them, no longer fragile in the same way, no longer waiting to break. It held. Rex stood just inches from the gate, his posture no longer rigid, his weight balanced instead of braced, his breathing even in a way that spoke of something deeper than calm. It was not obedience. It was choice. Down the corridor, the approaching footsteps grew louder, more defined now, voices layered over them, routine returning with the certainty of a clock that did not pause for moments like this. "We will take care of it now," one voice said, firm, detached, already halfway through the process in tone alone. Another responded with a quiet agreement, papers shifting, keys clinking lightly against a belt. Rex's ears turned toward the sound again, his body reacting out of habit, muscles tightening just slightly, not in aggression, but in anticipation of what always came next when humans moved with that kind of purpose. But this time, something else happened. He did not step back. He did not retreat into the far corner of the enclosure. His eyes flicked to Daniel, just for a second, then back to the corridor, then back again. A question, not of fear, but of direction. Daniel saw it. He understood it for what it was. He rose slowly from the ground, not abrupt, not towering, giving the movement space so it would not feel like pressure. When he stood, he did not close the distance. He did not reach for the gate. He simply remained there, upright now, but still grounded, still steady. The footsteps reached the end of the corridor, two officers coming into view, one holding the clipboard, the other already pulling a set of keys from his belt. They slowed when they saw Daniel standing there. "You should not be this close," one of them said, his tone carrying more warning than curiosity. "That dog is not safe." Daniel did not look away from Rex when he answered. "He is not unsafe," he said calmly. "He is unheard." The words landed differently than expected, not loud, not confrontational, but firm enough to shift the air in the room. The officer with the keys hesitated, glancing at his partner, then back at Daniel. "We have orders," he said, lifting the clipboard slightly as if it explained everything. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that without accepting its finality. Then, for the first time since he entered, he reached toward the gate, not quickly, not forcefully, but with the same measured intention he had carried into every movement so far. His fingers rested lightly against the metal, just beside where Rex stood. He did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he looked directly at the dog, his voice low but steady. "You do not have to prove anything to them," he said. "You already showed me." Rex held his gaze, his body no longer tightening at the presence of the other men, no longer reacting to the shifting energy behind him. The tension that had defined him in every report, every label, every failed attempt, was not gone, but it was no longer in control. He stood there, present, aware, choosing where to place his attention. The officer with the keys stepped closer, uncertainty now edging into his movements. "If you are wrong about him," he began, but the sentence did not finish. It did not need to. Daniel turned his head slightly then, just enough to acknowledge him. "I am not," he said, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty, the kind that came from seeing something others had not taken the time to look for. Then he turned back to Rex, his hand still resting against the gate, waiting. Not commanding, not forcing, just waiting for the same thing he had waited for from the beginning. A choice. And this time, Rex did not hesitate. The latch made a soft metallic sound as the officer with the keys stepped forward, hesitation still lingering in the way his fingers hovered before committing to the lock. as if even he could feel that something had shifted in the air, something that did not match the routine he had carried out so many times before. Daniel did not rush him, did not speak, did not break the fragile alignment that had formed between himself and the dog. Rex stood still on the other side of the gate, his body no longer braced for impact, no longer preparing for resistance, but held in a quiet readiness that came from somewhere deeper than training. The key slid into place. With a soft click, the kind of sound that usually marked the beginning of control, of containment being tested, of something unpredictable about to be forced into submission. But this time, no one moved quickly. The gate opened just a few inches, enough to change the boundary, not enough to erase it completely. The officer stepped back instinctively, creating distance, leaving Daniel alone at the threshold. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. Rex did not lunge. He did not retreat. He watched the opening, then looked back at Daniel, as if confirming that this, too, was his choice. Daniel lowered his hand slightly, not reaching into the enclosure, not crossing the line that had just been loosened, but inviting something else to cross instead. "You do not have to come out," he said softly. "But you can." The words were simple, but they carried something unfamiliar to Rex: permission without pressure, space without expectation. For a second, nothing happened. Then Rex shifted his weight forward, one paw stepping closer to the opening, stopping just short of the threshold. His ears flicked back briefly, then forward again, processing not fear, but memory. The countless times movement had been met with correction, the time stepping forward had meant being pulled back, redirected, restrained. But none of that came now. Only stillness. Only Daniel, standing there without tension, without demand, without the invisible push that had always followed before. Rex took another step. Slow. Measured. His paw crossed the line of the gate, touching the concrete outside the enclosure for the first time in a way that did not carry resistance with it. The officers behind Daniel stiffened slightly, their bodies reacting before their minds could catch up, but no one spoke. No one interrupted. Rex paused there, halfway between what had been decided for him and what he was choosing now. He lifted his head, looking at Daniel, searching not for instruction, but for confirmation. Daniel gave none. Only presence. Only steadiness. That was enough. Rex stepped forward again, his body moving fully through the opening, not rushed, not hesitant anymore, but certain in a way that did not need to be explained. The gate behind him remained open, the space he had stood in moments ago now empty, holding only the memory of what had almost ended there. Rex stood beside Daniel, not pressed against him, not seeking contact, but close enough to share the same space without conflict. His breathing was steady, his posture neutral, his eyes clear. The label that had followed him, the one stamped across pages and spoken in quiet warnings, no longer fit the shape of what stood there now. Daniel glanced down at him briefly, a small shift in his expression, not pride, not relief, but recognition of something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. One of the officers exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders as he lowered the clipboard in his hands. "I have never seen that before," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Daniel did not respond. He did not need to. Rex moved his head slightly, his gaze drifting down the corridor, then back again, no longer scanning for threat, but aware, present, grounded in a way that could not be forced. And in that quiet hallway, under flickering lights and the fading edge of night, a decision that had once seemed final dissolved without announcement, replaced by something far less certain, but far more true. The corridor did not return to what it had been, even as the routine tried to resume around them, because something had already changed in a way that could not be undone by paperwork or procedure. The gate remained open behind Rex, a quiet reminder of a space that no longer defined him, and the clipboard in the officer's hand now felt heavier than it had moments before, its words no longer aligning with what stood plainly in front of them. Daniel turned slightly, not pulling Rex with him, not issuing a command, simply shifting his direction as if inviting movement rather than requiring it. Rex watched him for a brief second, then followed, not out of habit, not out of training, but because the space beside this man felt different from any he had known before. They moved down the corridor together, slow and unforced, the soft sound of paws against concrete no longer echoing with tension, but with a steady rhythm that matched the quiet morning beginning to rise outside. The other officers stepped aside without being asked, their eyes tracking the dog, as if trying to reconcile what they had been told with what they were now seeing. One of them reached for the clipboard again, flipping through the pages as if searching for an explanation that had been missed, something written between the lines that could make sense of this shift, but there was nothing there. Only the same words, the same conclusions, the same final decision that now felt incomplete. Daniel stopped halfway down the corridor, not because he needed to, but because Rex did. The dog paused, his attention caught by a faint reflection in the glass of a nearby office window, his own image staring back at him, still, composed, unfamiliar in its calm. He tilted his head slightly, studying it, as if seeing himself not as he had been labeled, but as he was in this moment. Daniel gave him the time to do that. No interruption, no correction, just space. After a few seconds, Rex looked away from the glass and back to Daniel, his posture settling once more into that quiet balance he had found. They continued forward. The main door at the end of the corridor stood open now, morning light spilling in fully, brighter than before, carrying with it the scent of cool air and something else, something open, uncontained. Rex slowed as they approached it, his steps more deliberate again, not from fear, but from awareness of crossing into something new. Daniel stopped just short of the threshold, turning slightly to face him, not blocking the path, not guiding it, simply present at the edge. "This is where it changes," he said quietly, his voice steady, not instructing, not promising, just acknowledging what stood in front of them both. Rex looked past him, out into the light, then back again, as if measuring the distance between what had been decided for him and what he could now choose. The world outside did not call to him with urgency. It did not demand. It simply existed, waiting. Daniel did not step forward. He did not lead. He let the moment belong to the dog entirely. A breeze moved through the doorway, lifting the edge of Rex's fur slightly, carrying new scents, new sounds, a different kind of space than the one behind him. Rex took a breath, deeper than before, and stepped forward, crossing the threshold with a quiet certainty that did not need to be witnessed to matter. He moved into the light, not looking back immediately, not hesitating, just continuing until he stood a few feet beyond the door, then turned his head slightly, glancing over his shoulder. Daniel was still there, exactly where he had been, not following, not claiming, simply allowing. That was enough. Rex turned forward again, his posture steady, his presence calm, no longer defined by what had been written about him, but by what he had just chosen for himself. And in that small, quiet step into the morning, the story that had nearly ended in silence found something else instead, something softer, something truer, something that did not need to be declared to be real. The morning did not rush to welcome him. It unfolded slowly, like it understood that some steps were not meant to be hurried. The air outside carried a cool softness, brushing lightly against Rex's coat as he stood just beyond the doorway, the world wider than anything he had known in a long time, yet not overwhelming in the way it might have been before. The sounds were different here. Distant traffic humming low across the street, a flag somewhere above shifting gently in the breeze, the quiet murmur of voices far enough away to feel like part of the background rather than a demand for attention. Rex took another step forward, then another, each one steady, each one chosen, his body no longer braced against the unknown, but moving through it with a calm that had not been forced into him, only revealed. Behind him, Daniel remained at the threshold for a moment longer, watching not as someone monitoring behavior, but as someone witnessing a change that did not need to be controlled. Then he stepped forward as well, closing the distance without closing the space between them. Rex did not flinch at the movement. He did not check over his shoulder this time. He simply continued, aware, grounded, present in a way that made every small detail feel clearer, sharper, as if the world itself had shifted just enough to meet him differently. They reached the edge of the lot where the concrete gave way to a narrow strip of grass, still damp with early morning dew. Rex paused there, lowering his head slightly, not in caution, but in curiosity, his nose catching the scent of earth and something living beneath it. He stood there for a few seconds, breathing it in, as if reacquainting himself with a part of the world he had almost been separated from entirely. Daniel stopped beside him, not speaking, not interrupting the moment, his presence still the same quiet constant it had been from the beginning. A few yards away, one of the officers had stepped outside, the clipboard still in his hand, though now it hung loosely at his side, its authority diminished by what he had seen. He watched in silence, his expression no longer certain, no longer aligned with the conclusion he had once accepted so easily. Daniel glanced in his direction briefly, then back to Rex, his voice low, almost reflective. "They were looking for control," he said, not expecting a response, not needing one. "You were waiting for understanding." Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound, not because of the words themselves, but because of the tone, the steadiness that had become familiar in such a short span of time. He turned his head just enough to look at Daniel, his amber eyes clear, no tension behind them now, only awareness. Then, without hesitation, he stepped closer, not pressing in, not seeking reassurance, but choosing proximity in a way that spoke louder than anything forced ever could. Daniel let out a slow breath, a small shift in his posture, not relief, not triumph, but something quieter, something closer to respect. He reached down then, not quickly, not claiming, but allowing his hand to rest lightly against the side of Rex's neck, just for a moment, a simple contact that carried no demand, only acknowledgement. Rex did not pull away. He did not tense. He stood there, accepting it. Then after a second, he leaned just slightly into the touch, not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to close the distance. In his own way, the officer by the door exhaled softly, almost without realizing it, the sound carried away by the breeze before it could settle. The clipboard slipped from his hand to his side completely now, no longer needed in the way it once had been. Daniel straightened again, his hand falling back to his side, the moment complete without needing to be held onto. "Come on," he said quietly, not as a command, but as an invitation. Rex turned forward, his posture steady, his steps even, and moved with him across the open space, not led, not driven,